In the last video, we were looking at the flow of water through a plant, how it gets from the external soil environment into the plant and then where it goes. We left off with that water in the leaf, which brings us to photosynthesis because that is the main job of leaves. This is still happening in a lot of the stem tissue as well, especially for annual plants that probably don't go through any secondary growth, the formation of woody tissues to get bark. So their epidermis might still be green and photosynthesizing. So some of that water is going to go to that process, and this whole kind of part that we're talking about right now would still apply to most of the shoot of an annual plant. So some of the water is broken down in the leaves during photosynthesis. We know that that happens at PS2, photosystem 2, the pièce de résistance, to replace an electron on a chlorophyll molecule. So we're stealing the electrons from water, breaking it apart, making oxygen as a waste product. The rest of that water is going to evaporate from the plant. So it moves from the soil through all the plant tissues. Some of it gets used for photosynthesis, and then the rest evaporates out of the plant. And that is through the stomata, which are these controlled openings in the epidermis of the plant that are surrounded by guard cells. So we have these two guard cells here, so one on each side, and they flank an opening, a pore, called a stoma, which means mouth. So those two guard cells can open and inflate and deflate, really, to open and close that stoma. And that is detailed in great detail in your textbook of how that works. So this process is regulated by guard cells. The opening and closing of the stoma, or stomata, plural, is regulated by the action of these guard cells. This process of evaporation of water through plant tissues is called transpiration. I'm going to use that term. It's an important term globally. It's a huge part of our water cycle, is this pulling of water from the external soil environment through plant tissues, purifying that water, removing any contaminants from it, and releasing as water vapor purified, filtered water. Something important in this process that you'll learn about when we do anatomy is the thick waxy cuticle that we know evolved when plants moved onto land and had to protect themselves from water loss. So that waxy cuticle is stained pink here, made out of lipids. It covers the epidermis, prevents water from leaving through the other epidermal cells. So that's why water is only going to be escaping through those stomata, because they're an opening, right? And so that is connection between the external environment and the internal environment, and water will just passively move out by diffusion, because a plant is 90% water. So unless it's 90% humidity out, it's more water concentration within the plant than outside the plant. But again, a high concentration of solutes will help keep that water in. Okay, so how can we help regulate transpiration? The cuticle is one way. Control of when our stomata are opened and closed is another. And we looked at the types of photosynthesis that allowed us to close our stomata sometimes, even when we need to have CO2. So you can review that content to remember, what was the type of photosynthesis that allowed us to do that? Another way to avoid too much water loss is by covering yourself in hairs, right? So if you think of plants that grow in desert, dry environments, often they will be covered in these sort of shimmery white hairs. So trichomes are these hairs on the external surface of a plant, and they are a way to prevent water loss, and it can happen in several ways. So trichomes have a lot of functions. Here we see some trichomes that might not necessarily have just one function. So these trichomes could prevent water loss, but they also have this sticky stuff that they're excreting into the environment. So this is not extremely sticky on tomatoes, and I can't remember what this compound is called. I should have looked it up. But this is where the smell of a tomato plant comes from. That really distinct smell comes from this liquid that comes out of the trichomes that are covering a tomato plant. And so this could be another function of a tomato, right? That is going to either repel herbivores or potentially like gum up their mouth parts in some way or produce some compounds that might be toxic to small organisms. Those are all things that trichomes can participate in to prevent herbivory. So they have a lot of functions. But the one we're looking at here is this prevention of water loss. So this is, I think, a silky beach pea. You can find them out in the dunes. And the leaves are just covered with tiny little hairs. The actual epidermis itself, or the cells underneath the epidermis, would be a dark green because they're full of that chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. But they look silvery white because they're covered in trichomes. So this helps reflect sunlight because we've now given it a lighter surface so the plant won't get as hot. Again, you're going to have to balance this with the amount of photosynthesis that you need to do. It also provides a different layer of air right next to the plant. So we have this external air here that might be relatively low humidity, and then we have this little forest basically on the surface of the leaf. And if you think about a forest on land, and on a hot summer day, if you were to walk into the woods, what it's like, or a hot dry day, and then you walk into the woods and there's like moisture in the air, it's cool, it's damp. So that is like a mini version on the surface of a leaf. You have this little forest that can keep a different humidity amount by having all these structures for the water to condense on, and the air outside just isn't moving through that layer, it's moving over it. So now we have a higher humidity layer that's up against the leaf, and that is going to help prevent this diffusion of water out. Ooh, and that's what I have right here. The layer of trichomes creates a boundary between the air above the epidermis and the other air. So we have the ability to reflect light. We also have the ability to change the humidity concentration, or humidity, not concentration, right around the leaf to reduce water loss. The layer of trichomes creates a microclimate with higher water content, slowing diffusion. So that's sort of tied in with this boundary layer, slowing the air from flowing over it, slowing diffusion. So those are three ways that trichomes can help prevent water loss. Not their only job by far. Stomata can also be located only on the underside of a leaf, because if you imagine a leaf is oriented so that the upper side, which has more of the photosynthetic tissues, is full exposure to the sun like a giant solar panel. That's going to be the hotter surface, right? The underside is going to be shaded and cooler. So if we have our stomata only on the underside, there's this shadier, cooler environment that's less likely to be evaporating all of our water out. So often in plants that are not in a particularly wet or cool environment, so most plants will have stomata concentrated on the underside of the leaves. In some cases where it's really dry and water loss is a life or death scenario, those stomata will be tucked inside structures called stomatal crips. And you might have seen these on your pine needles. I think there was also another picture of a stomatal crypt at some point in one of your labs. We're going to look at these when we do the leaf anatomy lab for these plants that live in or are specially adapted to dry environments, xerophytes, like gymnosperms. So this is an angiosperm xerophyte that has these huge cavities on the underside of the leaf where the stomata are tucked into, and then they're surrounded by trichomes. So it's a double strategy. Have the stomata on the underside, but then have a even for like a cave, right? If you think about like how cool and damp caves are, that's what's going on here. And then we fill that cave with a forest. So extra cool, extra damp, really preventing that water loss from this super dry external environment. So how else could a plant limit water loss? This is a bit of a thought question for you, which you've seen in gymnosperms, but there's a lot that you haven't seen yet that will come up when we look at anatomy deeper. Here is a cross-section, fluorescent cross-section of a pine needle. Should look a little familiar to you. We have our stomata located in the hypodermis here, so having that second layer of epidermis, and then putting the stomata a little bit sunken. we have this whole layer of transfusion tissue that's surrounding our, transfusion tissues here, surrounding our vascular bundles. So for water to get out, it would have to move through all of these tiny cells. What else do we have? We have an endodermis here that surrounds our transfusion tissue and our vascular bundles. And that endodermis is going to be sealed with wax. So that kind of prevents this movement of water from the transfusion tissue outward. It'll keep all that water in the vascular bundles. Very slow movement of water outward. And we also have a thick waxy cuticle on the outside of this leaf that you can't see here. The last thing is just the overall structure. So that we have a relatively high volume for surface area. Like if you consider this leaf, it's a big flat leaf. You can't see the rest of the leaf, it's a little thin section here, but we have a lot of surface area to the amount of volume. This one has really strategized in the volume to surface area ratio, which prevents the amount of photosynthesis you got to do. Here is another xerophytic plant. You'll see these in the dunes. This is the European beach grass, if you take a cross section through that leaf. So this leaf has rolled up in on itself, and all the stomata are going to be located here on this internal layer. And I like it because it looks like each vascular bundle is a little skull. Pretty fun. So all the stomata are in here. The leaf rolls inward, protects all those stomata, and keeps them in this internal, more humid environment, because as water evaporates out of those stomata, it'll be trapped in here for a little while. There's a bunch of trichomes in here, and then the outer layer is covered by a thick waxy cuticle, and it has an appearance that's called glaucous, where it is like a powdery whitish color. It's like a very pale green, and that's achieved by wax, not by trichomes. So many different adaptations and ways to prevent water loss. An interesting part of this leaf is that it can roll up, or it could unroll if it were in the conditions where it would be appropriate to. And it does that by having these cells located in each of these creases. There's a series of cells that are big and inflated when water is plentiful, but when it's too hot or dry, those cells shrink, and they're only on one side of the leaf. So when those cells shrink, they pull the other epidermis around, and that's what causes this leaf to curl. So we'll look at those types of cells specifically when we look at leaves, but they're called bulliform cells. So all of this is to prevent an excessive amount of water loss, because water in plants is all important. So a little overview of everything we talked about, right? You want to understand how water gets into a plant and interacts with the plant cells. What do plants have to do to get that water into their cells and to maintain that turgid condition? That's going to have to do with tonicity, diffusion, and osmosis. And you're thinking about that movement of water through the plant from the roots against gravity up the stems and out to the leaves. And for that one, you're going to be thinking about capillary action, cohesion, adhesion, those forces. Then we'll think about how water is going to be prevented from leaving the leaves, and those are going to be these morphological and anatomical adaptations of having trichomes, where the stomata are located, and then some other adaptations of overall leaf structure.